Hi, everybody. This is Linda Martin, and I am back with James Junkin of Mariner Golf Consulting and Services. And we're going to do another Safety Bites. And I'm here with James Junkin. And today, James and I are going to talk about ESG. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about ESG, but we're going to talk about it in a little bit more depth today. So, James, do you want to start us off with what ESG actually is?
Yeah, ESG is I'll give you the acronym: environment, social, and governance, or some variations of that, depending on the people that you talk to. But really, what we're talking about is old school sustainability with more governance, more social consciousness in it, and an emphasis on the environment. So ESG is everywhere in the news. It's all over LinkedIn. A lot of actions on the international scale, particularly in Europe, bleeding over into the financial markets in the United States.
And you know, James, one of the things that I really kind of have noticed about ESG, and we can talk about why this is kind of coming into play in a little bit more depth in a second here, but I've noticed that a lot of the components of ESG that people talk about, many companies have already been doing or have been doing for years, decades, et cetera. At least the environment and the social and the governance has kind of come around to tie all of these together, because at least from my perspective, what is happening is that we are becoming more aware of how our companies or organizations handle these different issues that come up and report them out to their stakeholders or their shareholders or investors. And am I getting that right?
Absolutely. A lot of the metrics that are involved in ESG programs are things that safety professionals ought to be familiar with. You know, emissions on the environmental side. If your focus is primarily in the safety practice, you don't have a lot of experience in the environmental side, you may have to catch up a little bit. But some of these things are metrics that we should be familiar with related to our normal practice of safety. And that's why ESG concerns and from the C-suite are being directed in many cases to the person that's in charge of occupational safety and health. So a lot of the considerations on the social side, not all of them, but a lot of them are handled in the United States from a regulatory standpoint. Regulations, the EEOC Commission, you know, anti-discrimination laws and that kind of stuff. So ESG, in my opinion, from the metric side, is really about demonstrating that you're doing what you say you do and proving that to the investment community. This is started out as a evaluation of a company's risk in these different areas. And so when we're talking about environmental risk, are you conscious of what you're doing as far as emissions are concerned? You see a lot of this nowadays, you know, net zero, a lot of commercials. All that's being driven by ESG considerations in the financial sector. And it gets played down to, in many cases, to the safety professional that's in charge in these particularly publicly traded companies. Where I have concern is now that's filtering downstream into the supply chain. And a lot of contractors, particularly those that are not large contractors and not publicly traded contractors, may be ill prepared to deal with these questions because these questions are being propounded on them typically through one of the three third-party verification systems, such as Veriforce, ISNet World Nevada, ComplyWorks up in Canada. So contractors get these questions and they got to deal with these questions that, you know, how much water are you using? What are you doing to conserve water? How do you deal with your land usage? How are you dealing with your carbon footprint?
How do you treat your people?
Things, how do you treat your people? What are you doing for diversity, inclusion, you know, and equity type stuff? Those things typically are handled by HR, but you're starting to see that more and more land on the laps of safety professionals. And frankly, you know, a lot of non-publicly traded contractors or contractors that aren't huge contractors, whether they're privately held or whatever, they've been shielded somewhat from this scrutiny, if you will. Now, the investment community is saying that creates latent risk. that risk is now in the supply chain.
Mhm.
So let's take child labor, for example. For many years, large corporations would be absolutely will tell you we're not using any child labor that's abhorrent and et cetera, morally objectionable and all that. But deep down within the supply chain, especially as we've gone into a global economy, you may find instances where there are contractors and subcontractors of contractors
Mhm.
that are using child labor,
Right.
that have no moral sense or obligation. And so part of the social aspect of that is for these for hiring clients, particularly those large clients, publicly traded, is you're responsible for your supply chain now. And it will be an evaluation of the risk that's calculated into your stock evaluation of whether we want to invest with you. Same thing's true when it comes to your governance side. Have you had a bunch of corporate scandals? Not to go back too far in time, but investors don't want to put their money into a product and then find out we got an Enron situation going on, right? So it's an evolution of some old principles, and I think we're struggling because there's like 11 different standards out there. There are 4 or 5 different scoring systems.
That's right.
And so my advice to companies and even non-publicly traded companies, but publicly traded companies within the supply chain of organizations that need to consider ESG, is they need to start doing something.
Right.
Do something. Think about these 3 categories, have a plan of action, and start developing the metrics so that you can say that you are doing what you say you're doing.